You're scrolling late at night when you see it, a photograph of a building so impossibly ornate, so breathtakingly detailed that it stops you cold. The caption says it was built in 1893 for a World's Fair, constructed in just months, then demolished. Something feels off. How could craftsmen create such magnificence in weeks when today's buildings take years and look like concrete boxes? You click deeper. More photographs emerge. Train stations dripping with sculptural detail, courthouses that rival European cathedrals, entire exhibition halls that seem ripped from another age. Don't forget to subscribe to learn more about our hidden history. And then you find the maps. Old maps, official maps from the 1700s and 1800s, all showing the same thing, a massive territory labeled Tartaria or Tartary, sprawling across Asia, sometimes stretching into North America. Yet you've never heard this name in any history class. It's not in textbooks. Ask anyone on the street and they'll give you a blank stare. The theory crystallizes as you read. What if there was an advanced global civilization called Tartaria that built these architectural wonders? What if a cataclysm, a mud flood, or a deliberate reset buried this civilization, literally and figuratively? The evidence seems everywhere once you start looking. Buildings with their first floors below street level, as if the ground rose to swallow them. Structures labeled insane asylums that look more like palaces. Technology in old photographs that seems too sophisticated. And always those maps with Tartaria written in bold letters across continents. Millions of people have fallen into this rabbit hole, and it's not hard to see why. There's something genuinely unsettling about the contrast between the craftsmanship of 1890 and the sterile architecture of today. There's something compelling about questioning official narratives, especially when we know governments have lied about history before. And there's something deeply human about wanting to believe we came from greatness, that we've lost something magnificent. But here's where the story takes a turn, because Tartaria was real, just not in the way the conspiracy suggests, and understanding what it actually was reveals something fascinating about how we remember, forget, and reimagine the past. The official story might dominate textbooks, but it never conquered everyone. In living rooms across continents, grandparents lean close to grandchildren and whisper different timelines. "My grandfather said those buildings were already here," they say, voices dropping as if the walls themselves might report back. "He said they just moved in and claimed them." These aren't random stories. They're threads of a different tapestry, one that refuses to be completely unraveled. Indigenous elders speak of before times with a specificity that makes historians uncomfortable, describing buried cities and advanced peoples who vanished in cataclysm. Secret societies and esoteric traditions have always murmured about lost civilizations, keeping knowledge alive in symbols and rituals when words became dangerous. But something shifted with the internet. Suddenly, the isolated voices found each other. A researcher in Russia shares photographs of mud-covered first floors. An architect in Australia notices identical star fort patterns across continents. A grandmother in Kansas uploads her family's old maps, the ones her father hid in the attic because they showed borders that weren't supposed to exist anymore. These fragments connect, pixel by pixel, into a mosaic of collective memory. The keepers of memory are no longer scattered and silent. They're building networks, cross-referencing evidence, creating archives that can't be burned because they exist everywhere and nowhere. The resistance isn't dramatic. It's quiet, methodical, stubborn. Photographers race against demolition crews capturing ornate buildings in their final hours before the wrecking ball erases them from physical reality. Genealogists scan old maps before libraries discard them as outdated or inaccurate. Children sit with dying elders, recording stories that contradict what they'll learn in school, preserving the tension between official history and lived memory. Parents teach their kids to look closely at old buildings downtown, to notice the sunken doorways, the buried windows, the floor that's clearly underground now but has the architecture of a grand entrance. You can become a keeper too. It starts simply. Walk through your city's oldest neighborhood with new eyes. Find the courthouse or train station built in the 1890s. Does the official construction timeline match the craftsmanship? How many skilled artisans would it take to carve those details? Are there windows below street level? Doorways that open to basement darkness? Photograph them, document them, share them with others who are looking. Because here's the powerful truth. Every person who sees and questions performs an act of remembrance. Every photograph saved, every story shared, every child taught to notice the strange gaps in official narratives is a small resurrection. Remembering isn't passive, it's reconstruction. It's bringing Tartaria, whether as civilization, symbol, or question, back into collective consciousness where it can't be erased. If enough people remember, does the thing remembered live again? Not in stone and mortar, perhaps, but in something more dangerous to those who prefer we forget. In awareness, in questions that won't stay buried, in the understanding that history is written by victors, but rewritten by those who refuse to stop looking. The core claim is staggering in its scope. There was a worldwide civilization called Tartaria, technologically and culturally advanced beyond what we're told about the 1800s, and it was deliberately erased from history. Not just forgotten, actively buried, both literally and in our collective memory. The believers point to evidence that at first glance seems difficult to dismiss. Those World's Fair buildings you saw in the photographs, they weren't built for the fairs at all, the theory goes. They were Tartarian structures already standing, repurposed for exhibitions, then systematically demolished to hide the truth. Look at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Hundreds of buildings featuring architecture that supposedly took only months to construct, then destroyed immediately after. Why build such magnificence only to tear it down? Unless, of course, you weren't the one who built it. The construction timelines feel impossible when you examine them closely. Courthouses with hand-carved details covering every surface completed in a year. Train stations with sculptural complexity that would challenge modern crews with power tools erected in months. The official explanation requires believing that armies of craftsmen worked at superhuman speed during an era when everything was done by hand. But there's another explanation that sidesteps this problem entirely. What if they simply moved into existing buildings and backdated the construction to hide an inconvenient truth? Then there's the mud flood, a cataclysmic event that supposedly buried the first floors of buildings worldwide, literally covering Tartaria's civilization under feet of earth and sediment. The evidence seems everywhere once you know to look. Windows at sidewalk level that clearly weren't designed as basement windows, ornate doorways opening below ground, entire floors swallowed by streets that rose mysteriously over decades. Cities across the world share this same strange feature. Coincidence or evidence of a global catastrophe? The claims expand outward from there. Star forts, geometric fortifications with perfect angular symmetry appear on every continent in nearly identical designs, built supposedly by cultures that never contacted each other. Free energy technology harvested from the atmosphere through elaborate cupolas and spires, later suppressed by emerging oil and electric industries. Remarkably similar architectural styles spanning continents, suggesting a unified global culture rather than isolated civilizations developing independently. Millions have embraced these ideas, and dismissing them as simple foolishness misses something crucial. These believers aren't stupid. They're responding to real discrepancies that deserve better answers than condescending dismissal. They've watched governments lie about wars, corporations hide dangers, institutions rewrite inconvenient facts. When you've been deceived before, pattern recognition shifts into overdrive.
And there's genuine grief here, too, a mourning for beauty we've lost. Modern architecture is often soulless, efficient, cheap, designed for profit rather than transcendence. When you compare a strip mall to an 1890s train station, something broken inside us recognizes what we've traded away. The Tartaria theory offers an explanation for that loss that's both romantic and rebellious. We didn't decline naturally. Something magnificent was deliberately taken from us. But here's where the story gets genuinely interesting. Because Tartaria wasn't invented by conspiracy theorists. It was real. Those maps you saw weren't forgeries or fabrications. European cartographers really did label vast stretches of Asia as Tartary or Tartaria for over 500 years. Open any atlas from the 1600s or 1700s and there it is, sprawling across the continent in confident lettering. The question isn't whether Tartaria existed on maps. The question is what that word actually meant to the people who wrote it. The name came from the Tatars, nomadic peoples who terrified medieval Europe during the Mongol invasions. But European mapmakers didn't just use Tatar. They twisted it, blending it with Tartarus, the Greek word for hell, the deepest abyss below Hades. This wasn't accidental. To medieval Christians, these Eastern warriors were literally demons from the pit, and the name stuck even as centuries passed and actual knowledge remained stubbornly vague. Tartary became Europe's label for the unknown, everything beyond the edges of comfortable geography, the vast mysterious lands where the Silk Road disappeared into rumor and legend. What actually existed there bears little resemblance to a unified civilization. The Mongol Empire rose and fractured into competing khanates. The Silk Road connected dozens of distinct cultures: Uyghurs, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Tatars, Turks, Persians, Tibetans, Chinese minorities, each with their own languages, religions, architectural styles, and political structures. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara flourished with astronomical observatories and stunning Islamic architecture. Nomadic peoples mastered the steppes with sophisticated social systems Europeans barely understood. This wasn't one civilization called Tartaria. It was a kaleidoscope of peoples and cultures that Europeans lumped together because they were distant, different, and difficult to categorize. The maps were real, but Tartary was never a nation with borders, a government, or a unified identity. It was a placeholder, a geographic catch-all that meant roughly that big, complicated area in Central Asia we don't know much about. Sometimes maps showed Great Tartary, or Independent Tartary, or Chinese Tartary, these subdivisions revealing the truth. Cartographers knew there were different regions and peoples, but lacked detailed information to map them accurately. So why did Tartaria vanish from maps? Not through conspiracy, but with knowledge. As European powers expanded colonial ambitions, as Russia pushed relentlessly eastward, as explorers and geographers gathered actual information about Central Asia, the vague label became obsolete. By the late 1800s, mapmakers could draw real borders, name actual nations and regions, identify specific peoples and territories. Tartary disappeared the way "Here Be Dragons" disappeared from ocean charts, not because dragons were killed, but because the blank spaces filled with genuine geographic knowledge. The erasure wasn't sinister, it was simply the replacement of educated ignorance with hard-won understanding. The evidence that seems so compelling begins to crack under closer examination, not through dismissal, but through context. Those impossible construction timelines, we have the photographs proving they happened, not just finished buildings, but construction in progress. Newspapers from 1893 documented the Chicago World's Fair construction daily, complete with worker counts, material shipments, and progress reports. Thousands of laborers worked simultaneously on different structures, and Victorian engineering was far more sophisticated than we give it credit for. They had steam-powered cranes, precision metalwork, standardized components, and something we've largely lost, a massive skilled workforce trained from childhood in specific crafts. The World's Fair buildings themselves reveal the misunderstanding at the heart of the theory. They weren't built from stone or permanent materials. They were constructed from staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and fiber spread over wooden frames. They looked magnificent in photographs, but were always meant to be temporary, designed specifically to be cheap, fast and impressive for a season. Contemporary accounts don't hide this, they celebrate it as innovative. Most were demolished exactly as planned because maintaining them would have cost fortunes, and they were already deteriorating. The few that survived, like San Francisco's Palace of Fine Arts, required complete reconstruction in permanent materials decades later. The claim that such ornate work was too advanced for the 1800s reveals how disconnected we've become from pre-industrial craftsmanship. The Victorian era was the peak of handcrafted detail, the final moment before mass production destroyed the apprenticeship systems that trained thousands of skilled artisans. Stone carvers, plasterers, ironworkers, these weren't rare geniuses but common tradesmen. What seems impossible to us was simply Tuesday for them. We think it's impossible because we've lost those skills, because modern construction prioritizes speed and profit over beauty. The mud flood evidence dissolves under urban planning history. Cities deliberately raised street levels throughout the 1800s and early 1900s. It's documented in city records, newspapers, and engineering journals. Seattle raised entire neighborhoods after fire devastated the city. Chicago lifted buildings on jacks to install sewage systems above swampy ground. Streets were graded, filled, elevated to solve flooding and sanitation problems. Those buried first floors aren't evidence of cataclysm, they're evidence of practical engineering decisions made by identifiable people for documented reasons. Star forts follow well-traced evolution from medieval castles. As cannons became powerful enough to demolish vertical walls, military architects developed angular designs that deflected cannonballs and eliminated blind spots. The designs spread globally because they worked, carried by European colonial expansion and copied by anyone facing artillery. We have the treatises explaining their geometry, the names of the engineers who designed specific forts, the dates of construction. And those photographs that look too good for the 1800s? Professional photography was remarkably advanced by the 1890s. But there's another factor, preservation bias. Photographers documented impressive buildings, not ugly warehouses. The magnificent structures survived in images, while thousands of ordinary, poorly built structures vanished without record, creating the false impression that everything built then was beautiful. We're seeing the highlights, not the average. So if the evidence doesn't hold up, why does the theory grip so many intelligent people so powerfully? Because it's built on foundations of genuine truth, even if the structure erected upon them is fantasy. Historical erasures are absolutely real. Indigenous civilizations across the Americas, Africa, Australia, and the Pacific were systematically destroyed, their achievements minimized, their monuments attributed to outside influences because colonizers couldn't accept that primitive peoples built sophisticated societies. The Spanish melted Incan gold, burned Mayan codices, demolished temples. The British looted and lost artifacts that contradicted their narratives of bringing civilization to savages. These aren't conspiracy theories, they're documented historical facts. The instinct to question official narratives about lost civilizations isn't paranoid, it's learned from actual conspiracies of silence around colonial destruction. And the architectural mourning is completely legitimate. Modern buildings often are uglier, cheaper, more soulless than their predecessors. We've traded craftsmanship for efficiency, beauty for profit margins, public grandeur for corporate sterility. Walking through a city and feeling grief at that loss isn't delusion, it's aesthetic and spiritual honesty. Something valuable was genuinely lost when we stopped building for transcendence and started building for quarterly earnings. The Tartaria theory offers a romantic explanation for that decline, but the decline itself is undeniable. The distrust in institutions fueling these beliefs is also earned. Governments do lie about history. Corporations do suppress information. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was fabricated. Tobacco companies hid cancer research. Pharmaceutical companies downplayed addiction. CIA operations were dismissed as paranoid fantasy until documents proved them real. When institutions have broken trust repeatedly, turning skepticism toward other official narratives isn't irrational. It's pattern recognition based on experience. But here's the danger. Conspiracy thinking, even when rooted in legitimate grievances, can become a trap that prevents us from addressing real injustices. Every hour spent investigating whether ornate buildings prove a lost civilization is an hour not spent documenting actual suppressed indigenous histories, actual colonial erasures, actual ongoing destruction of cultural heritage. The Tartaria theory redirects justified anger about historical lies toward a fantasy that requires no accountability from anyone, no specific villains to confront, no concrete actions to take beyond research and awareness. Our brains are magnificent pattern recognition machines, evolved to find meaning in chaos because spotting patterns meant survival. But that same gift makes us vulnerable to finding patterns that don't exist, connecting dots into pictures that feel true because the human mind craves coherent narratives over ambiguous reality. The real work isn't uncovering Tartaria, it's investigating actual suppressed histories. The African kingdoms whose sophistication was deliberately downplayed, the Native American engineering feats attributed to mythical lost tribes, the systematic destruction of records that documented non-European achievement. These stories don't require mud floods or global resets. They just require looking at what was actually destroyed, actually hidden, actually lied about. And unlike Tartaria, confronting these truths demands something more difficult than belief. It demands we reckon with what was done, who did it, and what we owe the descendants of those erasures.